Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Epic Treatise, and today we're going to be taking a look at a video by Metatron, who says he has the truth about LGBTQ in ancient Greece once and for all. So all of those scholars studying ancient sexuality can stop. It has been solved by Metatron. That seems unusual, but we're going to have a look. And I'm going to be analysing this in the way I'm used to, which is as if I'm marking an undergraduate essay. So we're going to look at four basic things. One, is there a good general knowledge of the ancient world? Is Metatron engaging with the ancient sources and analysing those in a rigorous fashion? Is he engaging with the modern scholarship and again critically engaging with that scholarship? And finally, is the argument in general sound and well constructed? Spoilers, it doesn't go well for Metatron.
Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and as the most perceptive among you might have noticed, I have somewhat of a passion for the classical era, and just like with every other historical period discussed on this platform, I think the most important aspects of talking about history are sticking to the facts and to avoid bending, changing, misquoting or misrepresenting historical events. And we can all agree that that would be the perfect approach. I mean, at the end of the day, facts are facts. The truth is not an opinion.
Okay, the first thing to say is we don't really discuss facts in ancient history. There are facts in ancient history. Obviously, Athens was a thing, was a place, for example. But generally, when we're asking the more interesting questions in ancient history, what people thought, how people felt, how were people interacting with each other, we're almost never talking about facts. What we talk about in ancient history is what does the evidence suggest? What does the evidence point to? And that may produce a level of truth, a kind of truth, in that it is a balanced review of the possibilities, but it certainly doesn't point to the sort of capital T truth. And so this isn't really a very good way of thinking about the ancient world.
At least in a utopic reality. But unfortunately, we know that there are people out there that choose to look at history through the prism or lenses of their own ideologies, and also choose to misrepresent not only historical events, but entire cultures and people, say for example, ancient Greece, in order to be able to push their own ideologies, backing them up historically. This is the case, for instance, of this page, far from being the only one, which is clearly trying to use the framework of Greco-Roman civilization as a historical example of a gay social paradise. Obviously, this is done with the intent of normalizing same-sex relationships in the mind of modern people.
I think it's probably done because people like reading about people like them in the past. Children like hearing about what children were up to. Women like hearing about what women were up to. Men like hearing what men were up to. And funnily enough, gay people like hearing about what gay people are up to. I think inserting some sort of insidious propagandist element here is just wrong, frankly.
But it's far from being the professionally conducted comprehensive analysis that you would need to do that. This is biased, incompetent, shoddy work.
So here he now goes on a weird rant about how he's not a homophobe, and frankly, I just don't care, so I'm going to skip this whole bit.
In fact, if you are LGBTQ and watching, what I'm about to read should piss you off. Your quest for historical representation should be satisfied on the balance of probabilities based on unbiased evidence, not this. And I'll show you why.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant. So let's see a whole load of evidence. Let's see us go through that evidence in a really detailed way and get a really good idea of how the ancients wrote about and thought about men having sex with men in the ancient world.
So, here's the burning question for today. Was ancient Greece an LGBTQ plus paradise where same-sex relationships were not just tolerated but in fact encouraged and regarded as the highest form of love, superior even to heterosexual ones, and fully accepted by everyone at a societal level?
he's framed that question in a really weird way there. So if you were going to pick a place in which to be a gay man at any point in history, you'd probably pick somewhere in Northwest Europe in the 2020s. Your chances of being arrested, tortured, killed for being a gay man in our society is extraordinarily low, nearly zero. And so this is, in some ways, as close as we've got to a gay paradise. Does homophobia still exist? Absolutely, yes. Of course it does. Will any given gay man have experienced that homophobia at some point in their life? Yes, absolutely, probably quite recently. But does that mean that homosexuality is not accepted on a societal level? No, of course it doesn't. The fact is that so accepted is homosexuality in our society that two men can go to the government and say, can you give us a form that makes our relationship an official one and will have all the protection of the law behind it? And the government will say, yes, absolutely, just as if you were a man and a woman trying to do that.
Well, let's see how this page answers that. Homosexuality or same-sex attraction and relationships has been present in human societies for thousands of years. Oh, we absolutely agree on that. Don't expect that to happen again though today. In ancient Greece, homosexuality was a common and accepted part of society and was seen as a natural expression of love and desire.
So that seems like a much more natural way of phrasing this. In ancient Greece, homosexuality was a common and accepted part of society and was seen as a natural expression of love and desire. I think you could probably say the same thing about society today. You don't need to go further and say it was accepted by absolutely everyone and was the highest form of love. I think that's a perfectly acceptable thing to say, and let's continue assuming that is what we're arguing for and against.
Okay, how such a small paragraph can be wrong on so many levels is beyond me. I'll get back to that. This acceptance of homosexuality was reflected in various aspects of Greek culture, including art, literature, and religion. In ancient Greek art, homosexuality was also commonly depicted. Many Greek sculptures and paintings show men in romantic or sexual relationships with other men. These works of art were not seen as scandalous or shocking, but rather as beautiful and natural expressions of love and desire. And of course, no evidence presented, no links, just statements. I'm supposed to believe their words.
Okay, they haven't shown you the evidence, but there is a bunch of art with men being romantic with other men from the ancient world. So, I mean, they're right.
Well, here's a little psychology fact for you. Each time someone repeats their lie, they will feel more confident in what they are saying. Of course, this person is not going to show us the evidence to support words such as very common and many, when they know that such evidence will not support what they are saying and in fact ultimately dismantle their lie. I'll do that for you. Usually, when you talk about ancient Greek art representing erotic encounters between males, this predominantly consists of vases. Now, about 80,000 pottery pieces have been examined, and according to Dover, the author of the book Greek Homosexuality, published in 1978, which tends to be the basis of such statements.
Okay, whoa. So this guy seems to be suggesting that our view of sexuality in the Greek world is based on a book written in 1978. I mean, don't get me wrong, like Dover's work was important. It was the first time that someone had come out and said in a really clear way that all of these sort of writings and images of men engaging in sexualized behavior towards one another wasn't just a purely platonic friendship, that actually the ancient world was full of men who were having sex with men, and that this was a fairly accepted feature in Greek society. However, it's not the end of the story. I think the idea that all of our views of Greek homosexuality are based on something from 10 years before even I was born is just absurd.
Of these 80,000 pieces, only about 600, not even 1%, contain what could be considered homosexual scenes. Now, what Dover doesn't tell you in his book is that when you actually go and see this famous 600, only 30 maybe represent homosexual scenes. The other 570 complete wishful thinking. And there is a reason why I'm placing a maybe even for those remaining 30.
So I'm not here to defend Kenneth Dover. I don't see any point in defending a book that wasn't even written in the 21st century. Our understanding of Greek sexuality has moved on quite a bit since then. But to be honest, there is a lot of art. And if we're even just going to talk about Greek pottery, there are a bunch of Athenian pots with homosexual scenes on them. I'm not going to show them on YouTube, but you just go and Google image search Greek homosexuality, it will show you a bunch of them. And yeah, Kenneth Dover shows off a bunch more of them in his book.
First, because some of those 30 include non-humans, such as satyrs or satyrs, who shouldn't really count, since they were considered, as by the words of Pliny the Elder, as being wild, horrible, hideous, perverted tricksters, not the best representative of tolerance and acceptance of homosexuality at a societal scale. Not to mention most of the time satyrs wanted women anyways.
Hey, do you notice the little bait and switch he did there? So satyrs are not a good example of what was acceptable in society because they're evil creatures. They're naughty. They have unrestrained desires, and therefore they're not showing that male sexual activities were acceptable. However, at the same time, most of the scenes we see satyrs chasing after women. Well, doesn't that mean that when we're worrying about unrestrained desire, what we're worrying about is sexual intercourse with women, not sexual intercourse with men? And we should be considering sexual intercourse with men a more acceptable form of sex. You can't have your cake and eat it, Metatron.
Reason number 2, out of all these 30 scenes, Dover considered some of the heterosexual sex scenes as being gay. Why? Well, I can't show the scene, but the reason is because of the position chosen. So the guy chooses this position with a woman, then probably actually wanted another guy. He also thinks that this is a scene representing gay love. A guy with a sword who's about to stab the other guy, so of course this means he wants to have sex with him, right? So if we use common sense and we remove all the ones that are really a stretch of a stretch, then we are left with a real number of vases depicting actual homosexual intercourse. A whopping 0.000375%. That's not even 0.4%. Now how that qualifies as commonly depicted and many is beyond me.
So I really don't know where Metatron's got his maths from there. There are a load of paintings on Athenian pots of men having sex with men or men engaged in sexualized behavior with other men. The other thing is that one of the really significant features of Athenian pottery that he hasn't even engaged with is something called the kalos inscription. And one thing we see on tons and tons and tons of Greek pots are these little inscriptions that say a name and then the word kalos. And what that means is that this person, say Liagros, is beautiful. And beautiful in quite a saucy way. And if you look at, for example, the Beazley archive, it has over 700 of these pots. And you find them generally on bits of pottery made for the symposium, these sort of all-male parties, banquets, drinking parties, whatever you want to call them. And so it's very clear that one of the cool things in Athenian society is to have a pot with this or that youth or boy is really quite sexy. And this was definitely really common. You also find them with women's names and Calais, the feminine beautiful written on them, but those are really quite rare. And these inscriptions could either be carved into the pot, like you scratch this message into the pot, maybe at a party. They could be painted on the top of the pot, or they could actually be put on by the potter themselves. So when they're actually making the pot, they write so and so youth is beautiful. And what's quite interesting about that is it shows there was a market for these pots, saying one or the other particular youth in Athens was particularly beautiful. And this was something that men wanted written on their jugs when they were at a drinking party, so that other men could see that they found so and so youth particularly attractive. Does this prove that they were all engaged in homosexual acts? No, it doesn't. What it does show is that there is a broad acceptance, for attraction to youths and boys within the Athenian society. Now, to go back to an earlier point where a man is choosing a particular sexual act with a woman because really he wants her to be a man, if we could briefly move away from Athens, because all we've talked about so far is Athens, there is a story from Sparta that on their wedding night, young women would have their heads shaved, they'd be dressed up as young boys in order to ease young men who are used to relationships with other men into heterosexual lovemaking. Now, we can believe that or not, but they certainly believed that was plausible in the ancient world, which should pretty strongly suggest to us that the idea that homosexual love was a normal thing in society was just accepted.
This acceptance of homosexuality was reflected in various aspects of Greek culture, including art, literature, and religion. We briefly mentioned art. Let's talk literature. There are indeed many sources of evidence that we could discuss. Lyrical poetry, myths, philosophical treatises, speeches, inscriptions, medical texts, tragedies, comedies, curses, and anecdotes, where homosexuality is either ignored or condemned.
So, yeah, obviously a bunch of ancient texts ignore homosexuality. If you're writing about how to best run a farm or about the course of a particular military campaign, it's hard to see why it would come up. So I can agree there. Condemning it, however, well, as you promised earlier, let's see that evidence. We've got a good amount of evidence of people condemning homosexuality in the Greek world, then show it to us. Absolutely, bring it up. You've not given a category for accepting or even lauding homosexual relationships, which seems strange because famously there is a section in Plato's Symposium where the love between two men is laid out as being the most beautiful, the highest form of love. Why haven't you given a category for that? Do you deny there's any texts where the idea of the love between men or the love between men and youths is celebrated?
You're not going to mention those, are you? Because they don't support the picture that you're trying to paint, and therefore you're literally silencing the words of the ancients that disagree with your ideology. And that's intellectually dishonest, not only towards the ancient, but also towards the people that are believing in your words and didn't have the time to go check the original documents. And of course, I don't just ask you to believe me, I'll show you the evidence, but now let's keep reading.
Metatron, you keep promising this evidence, but we haven't been shown any yet. All you've done is, in a sort of very general way, said everything presented by Kenneth Dover in 1978 was nonsense, without actually engaging with all of that evidence in any sort of direct fashion. Where is this evidence of lots of people condemning homosexuality?
One of the most famous examples of homosexuality in ancient Greece is the story of Achilles and Patroclus. In Greek mythology, Achilles and Patroclus were two warriors who were close friends and companions. Many scholars believe that their relationship was more than just platonic and that they were, in fact, lovers. First of all, remove many scholars and replace with many activists, and only some scholars. See, differently from this person, I've actually read the original text. In the original story, as many of you who have watched the film Troy will already know, Achilles and Patroclus are described as friends.
Okay, anyone who's seen the film Troy will know that they are presented as cousins, something that's always going to get you a good laugh in any classics department around the world. As to being described as friends, I'm not sure what translation of the Iliad you were reading, but the words that Achilles uses to describe Patroclus is as his heteros, his companion, and his philtartos, his most beloved. Now, heteros can be used in a pretty general way to describe your companion, someone generally who you fight with. Philtartos, the most beloved, is used very rarely in the Iliad, but does have connotations of someone who is a lover. So if you're saying you've read this text, it's fairly obvious you haven't read it in the original Greek.
Patroclus is Achilles' friend. In the story, Achilles did have sex with many women, but never with a man. Okay, so if in the original story there's no mention of any sexual relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, and they're only mentioned as friends, then what do they base this statement on? Because when Patroclus died, Achilles was upset.
Yeah, there's no mention of sex between Patroclus and Achilles in the Iliad. There's basically no mention of sex between anyone in the Iliad. Sex is described in very euphemistic terms in the Iliad, and so we wouldn't necessarily expect an outright declaration that they were making love. As to it being based on him being sad, well, one of the lines of evidence is that his sadness really does go over the top. It's sort of covering yourself in ashes and wailing and thrashing and embracing Patroclus's body and describing his yearning for him. Pothos is the word he uses, which is a word that is often used to describe the yearning for a lover. And this is a really extreme reaction. It's the most extreme reaction to grief in the Iliad, which indeed might hint they are a little bit more than simply friends. But ultimately, I'm not sure this really matters. I mean, isn't the point rather than when we get to the classical world that they considered this pair to have been lovers? So when we get to an actual historical period in Greece, the people who were reading the Iliad thought about this pair as lovers, and they thought that was perfectly normal, and they thought it was perfectly fine for a pair of great heroes to be lovers.
Okay, so you're watching. Let's say you are a guy and you have a guy best friend. You were brought up together, you're very close, you have a very strong connection. Your friend dies, maybe there is an accident. If that upsets you, it means you're gay.
Literally nobody is saying that. That is just poisoning the well. Nobody is claiming that apart from you.
This is the logic. Now, if this video worked just like that article, I would leave it at that and I would not tell you that actually this idea of Patroclus and Achilles being gay lovers is not modern. It might be an idea that has been pushed by activists, but it's not an idea born from activists. In fact, it's ancient.
So you know that they were saying this in the ancient world. You already know that. Okay, well, let's hear about that then. However, why are we hearing about a novel? Like, why is it important what some random novelist wrote about? It's like when we brought up the Troy movie earlier. Why does that matter? Nobody in academia, nobody in ancient history, nobody knows anything about the ancient world, is basing their views on what Miller wrote in her novel or what was in the film Troy. This is just completely irrelevant to the debate.
And Miller, the author of the famous book Song of Achilles, definitely decides to go for the gay lover route. So to the person who wrote this article, let me show you how you present evidence from both sides and then let your audience decide and make their own mind. Let me show you how it's done. To give you precise context, what we're talking about is the Iliad. The Iliad was written by Homer. Homer lived in the 8th century BC.
Oh dear God. No, Homer did not live in the 8th century BC. Homer is a mythical figure. The Iliad was not a book that was written by one guy. The Iliad is a collection of oral stories that were brought together and adapted over a very long time from a very wide geographical area. So the classic example is probably the wounding of Aphrodite in the Iliad, which is fairly transparently lifted directly from the Epic of Gilgamesh. These are stories brought in from a wide area, both from the Greek world and outside the Greek world. How do we know this was adapted over a very long period of time? Well, one of the really good indicators, and one that often comes up, is the way they use chariots in the Iliad. So all the heroes in the Iliad ride around on chariots. However, in the period between these stories first being told and when they were written down eventually in the 6th century in Athens, the ideology of warfare had changed. True heroism in the late 6th century was to stand in the line with your fellow hoplites, your other citizen soldiers, and fight face to face on your feet. And therefore the much older style of warfare, where wealthy individuals would ride around on chariots throwing javelins at each other, was not thought of as heroic. So the way they used chariots in the version of the Iliad that's come down to us, that was written down, is that they use them as like battle taxis. They ride around on their chariots, then they get off and they stand shield on shield, crest on crest, and they fight another hero and they kill them, and then they get back on their battle chariot, on their battle taxi, and they ride around a bit more till they find another hero, and then they get off again and they fight them stood on the ground with a spear. So this is not a poem created by one dude. Homer is a myth, and the poem as a whole does not represent one particular period.
Hence archaic Greece. In the original text, Homer gives us zero mentions of Achilles and Patroclus being lovers. Nothing. And yet even in academia there are people that think that they were lovers and people that don't. With the likes of Gregory Nagy and Robin Lane Fox, some of the most influential and knowledgeable historians of ancient Greece, saying that they don't think that these two characters were in love.
Literally nobody in academia is discussing whether or not Achilles and Patroclus were lovers. Nobody cares. The interesting question is, why was their relationship viewed in that way in the classical world?
But as Miller herself tells us, the reason why she chose to go for the gay lovers route is because of the words of Plato. So in other words, Plato did think that Achilles and Patroclus were lovers. Here is the problem with that. Plato was a 5th century philosopher and writer. So as you can see, there is already 3 centuries of distance between him and the actual author of the Iliad.
There was no actual author of the Iliad. I can't believe I have to say that, but there was no actual author of the Iliad. Therefore, the difference in time between Plato and the author of the Iliad is a meaningless statement.
If they were lovers, then from the Greek point of view of the 5th century, it would have meant pederasty. And yet we have no evidence that pederasty was a thing at all in the 8th century when the Iliad was written.
No, just no, as before. Pederasty probably deserves a definition here. Pederasty is a relationship between an older man and a younger youth or boy. May in fact, probably was sexualized in most cases. That may have depended on the age of the boy involved, and indeed the interests of the man involved.
Okay, but still, an ancient Greek thought they were lovers, so I want to side with Plato. And that's absolutely okay. But the thing they don't tell you is that there is another author, Sisyphon, who completely disagreed with Plato and thought instead, and specifically said, that both Achilles and Patroclus were not in a relationship.
You're going to have a bit of a problem there. And the problem is that the text that comes from is Xenophon's Symposium. And that text, well, in general, is supposed to be funny. In fact, if you read it today, it is one of very few, possibly the only text from the ancient world that will still make you laugh out loud. In fact, at least it made me laugh out loud. It is a text that is meant to be funny. The other problem is that the character that Xenophon puts those words into the mouth of is Socrates. Now, what Socrates did in all the texts that he's presented in is he caused us to question the society which they were living in, caused them to question the society they were living in. So he questioned their beliefs and their structures of thinking. And so what he's trying to do in this text, in a sort of funny, ironic way, is claim that Achilles and Patroclus were not lovers, in order to create a debate and also to make us laugh as we read it. This isn't actually a particularly good way of understanding what Xenophon's views were. In fact, I don't think there's really any good way of getting to Xenophon's views through the medium of the Symposium, which is a light-hearted story about a drinking party.
And both Plato and Sisyphon were disciples of Socrates. So it's not right that they only mention the one they agree on and completely silence or ignore the one that they don't agree with. Also because Sisyphon was not just a guy, he was an Athenian-born military leader, philosopher and historian. And however you look at it, it's checkmate. If they choose to ignore him, then they are silencing him. They could of course tell us, nah, it's because he was a homophobe. Even if that were the case, if he was a homophobe, then that would contradict the idea or notion that 5th century Greece was a gay paradise.
No, none of that's true. And again, saying that there are homophobes in society, even if Xenophon was one, which I don't think he was, saying that does not detract from the possibility that men's attraction to other men and male sexual contact was acceptable in society. It would make absolutely no difference. Just the same as saying, well, there is a homophobe in Britain, therefore homosexuality is not socially acceptable. That does not follow.
If someone so prominent was a homophobe, my personal take is that they loved each other as brothers. If you disagree, that's fine, but it's important to present all the facts.
Well, so far, Metatron, you have presented none of the facts. There's another 12 minutes of this video, but this commentary is already ridiculously long. So, well, I'm going to call it quits here. I may come back to this and finish the rest of it. I think what's fairly obvious is that Metatron doesn't really know anything about the ancient world. He may have taken a passing interest in it, but he's not really able to engage with material that he would need to actually understand these issues. This is a fairly blithe dismissal of a very well-founded position amongst ancient historians. I'm going to stop now before my brain escapes through my ears. So until next time, I've been Epic Treatise, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon.